Hello and welcome back to Inside Update, a show brought to you by InsideInvestigator.org, which is a team of folks dedicated to rooting out corruption in Connecticut through investigative journalism. My name is Connor Dragotis. I am the managing editor here, sporting my new End Corruption hoodie, and I want to talk about transparency, which is why we have our resident expert, Katherine Revello, here. You know her basically because that is what she writes about. She knocks it out of the park. She's talking about all of the ways in which transparency is and is not happening in the state of Connecticut. Katherine, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Connor. It's Sunshine Week, so transparency, government accountability, FOIA, these are all great things to talk about this week.
Right. And let's clarify, it is the start of spring. So Sunshine Week is not just about things getting nicer generally. Like, what is Sunshine Week? Because I don't feel like a lot of people truly understand or might even know what that phrase is.
Right, so Sunshine Week is a week that's put on by FOI advocates, and it's when we really talk about FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, and why it's a great tool to help support exactly what our mission is to root out corruption by improving government transparency and accountability. And just let folks know that, this isn't a tool that's just out there for journalists. It's about public access to public records. So it's something that anybody can use.
Right. There's only so many hours in the day. And though I wish I had 7, 10, 20 Catherines who we could throw at uncovering every single bit of information in the state of Connecticut, we do rely on the public to help us out in our job, but also we want to arm you with the knowledge to do this stuff yourself because ultimately there's only so much journalism can do, right? We're not advocates. We are simply here to share information. What you do with it is a whole different story. That is probably a good transition, actually, though, into your investigation for this week. We're doing a lot of transparency things this week. You got videos, you got posts, you got articles, but this investigation is called Noticed. A Simsbury resident fights for open meetings, and it's a good one. It's really fantastic to kind of dig into this niche thing. Also, it has a tech angle as well. So I guess tell us what's going on in Simsbury.
Yeah, it does, right? So obviously, it being Sunshine Week, we're talking a lot about the open records side of FOIA, which means if you ask a public agency for records under FOIA, they have to provide them to you. But there's also another side of FOIA, which governs how public agencies can hold meetings and creates requirements for how those have to be open so that the public can access them and participate in them. And this story is about the Simsbury Library Board of Trustees and how one local resident basically found out that they were violating FOIA's open records requirements in quite an impressive number of ways with their agendas and meeting minutes. And so what's at issue here is what FOIA says is if you're a public agency, for the most part, you have to post your agenda publicly at least 24 hours in advance of that meeting day if it is a regular meeting. And you have to be pretty specific about a lot of those agenda items, especially if they have to do with going into executive session. If you want to enter executive session in a public meeting, it's not like something that you can just, go into because you feel like it. There are specific reasons listed in FOIA, and there are requirements for who can be in there. And essentially, what the Simsbury Library Board of Trustees is doing, and we can see this through their agendas that are publicly posted and through email communications that were shared with us, is they were not sticking to the agenda items for their public meetings, which is a problem with FOIA. At the end of their agendas, they were saying, we'll enter executive session if we need to, which again, you really can't do that. And then even though they went into executive session, if they decided after the fact it wasn't necessary, they were editing the minutes from previous meetings to reflect that, they didn't do that because it's actually breaking the law. And so there's a whole bunch of FOIA violations going on here, but probably the most interesting one has to do with hybrid meeting requirements, which, came about during COVID. So this is a fairly new part of FOI. And What's not super clear because of the way FOI is written, because the language that's actually currently in the law was pretty much adopted straight from an executive order that Governor Lamont signed during the initial COVID state of emergency. Um, is the language is different than what you would expect it to be. It doesn't actually say hybrid meeting, even though that's the language that I think we're now most used to using. So there's sort of some uncertainty in the law as to whether if, like we're on Zoom right now, Connor. So if we were holding a public meeting and we're meeting on Zoom, even though there is an actual physical meeting location, do you have to allow public participation on Zoom if you are allowing committee members? To participate on Zoom. And that's sort of what Lori Boyko, who is the really the subject of the story and who has really taken this library board to the Freedom of Information Commission with complaints about what they've been doing, is trying to argue. And there's a whole bunch more context in the story that has to do with essentially there was a controversy in this town that had to do with an art display that was put up at the library that was then kind of taken down and edited, and there was a special meeting that was held. It wasn't necessarily noticed in a way that the public was aware of what was going on. And that, if they had offered the ability to attend, because that meeting was held at like 9 in the morning, which is, kind of odd for most public meetings, maybe more residents would have been able to attend. So, that's kind of the gist of what's going on in this story. But that case has had a hearing before the Freedom of Information Commission, and now we're kind of just waiting to see what they say and if they're going to say, effectively what FOI says about hybrid meetings right now is good, or whether the law potentially needs to be revisited.
Man, law is tricky. Like I'm not an attorney. I've worked for law firms before, but always in, communications or administrative capacities. And when I get into this with lawyers, all of them kind of say, we're working with the best that we can do. And I guess maybe we should talk about these laws exist to prevent backroom deals is kind of a trigger phrase right now in Connecticut. We're hearing a lot about backroom deals in a lot of different capacities, but the point of transparency in these meetings and public notice and making sure that you can't just close the door on the public is so these sorts of opportunities for corruption don't arise, right? We just don't want to make it easy for people to self deal, handshake deal, inside deal, backroom deal. I mean, throw whatever phrase you want at it. But this is what Ms. Boyko is concerned about or just wants to make sure isn't happening as well, right? I mean, and I'll take it a step further. Her concern is not just about the library, but that this practice of not properly informing the public is happening, I think, if I'm recalling this correctly, in upwards of 20 different committees and legislative bodies in the town.
Yeah, that is her allegation, and essentially what, her argument is or her reason for bringing this forward is, that it's happening here. Maybe if we say, there's a great quote in this story where she's talking to somebody on this board where she says, you are breaking the law, and their response is kind of incredulous, like, really, is that what we're doing? And she's like, yes, yes, you are. It doesn't mean somebody's going to come and take you away in handcuffs, but FOIA is a law. And she's correct in that. So, that's really the point that she's trying to make is, hopefully if there's this one instance and we're talking clearly about wrongdoing by this library board here, and I'm using stronger language than maybe we would in a lot of these stories where we talk about allegations because this is pretty clear cut. But it's also not necessarily something that is being done maliciously per se, right? Sometimes, as you said, you're not a lawyer. A lot of people who work on these types of boards are some of them are volunteers. So, it may be an issue of just not understanding the law because it's complicated, but that is part of what she's trying to do is kind of, raise awareness, say like, hey, these are the rules. This is what the law says we're supposed to be doing. And, hopefully that is going to lead to people being more attentive to that other places in Simsbury.
I appreciate your candor. I mean, that's one of the reasons that we do this, right? I mean, I think we need to be able to talk about this not just as, uh, you know, from an arm's length and trying to talk about it in the abstract. We need to be able to recognize this has real human impact. this is, you as a journal, I mean, you don't want this happening in your backyard. I certainly don't want it happening in my backyard when these boards and organizations do things that impact our families, our kids, our neighbors, people we care and love about. It matters. It matters. I feel like it's important to say that we really do, especially in what we put out in our writing. Um, man, our editing process in many ways, I'm just looking for opportunities to say, hey, Katherine, strip yourself out of the story a little bit here. Let's just stick to, the A, B, C, D and let people handle it themselves. But in this forum, we want to pull back the curtain on how the sausage gets made, for lack of a better phrase. Like, we want you to understand what we're thinking about, why we care, why corruption needs to be rooted out in the first place, and where you in your town might want to look if you're concerned about something that might be going on. I mean, that's part of what Sunshine Week is all about, right? We want to raise that awareness, and if you're up for it, I'd love to talk about your tips too.
Yeah, absolutely.
You put together another wonderful edition of Transparency Update, not to be confused with Inside Update, which is a every other week publication about what's going on with transparency as in your experience as a journalist. And this week, you put out 6 tips for folks who are interested in pursuing FOIA for themselves or just learning more about it. Educate us, bring us up to speed on what we need to know in 2025.
Right, absolutely. So, right, basically what we've tried to do with this post is just kind of give you the basics of if you're interested, and I understand FOIA can be intimidating. In fact, when I was speaking of Lori, she was kind of, said something to the effect of, she was quite proud of herself that she had gone from somebody who wasn't paying attention to this stuff at all to somebody who was taking a hearing to the FOIC. And people who are doing this type of thing, particularly if they're not professionals like us, who, you pay me to spend time on this stuff, so I know this stuff. It's a lot to take on. And so what we're trying to do here is just kind of give you some of the tools where if you see something going on in your town and you want more questions about, or you want to answer questions about it, then, FOIA is a tool that absolutely is out there for everybody. Um, and there are some, kind of foundational things that you should know to make sure that your FOIA requests are going to be best directed and are going to be successful. A couple of those things are making sure that you are doing your background research on, right, because Connecticut's FOIA law is different than everyone else's in the state is, or every other state in the country is different than the federal law. So make sure you know what FOIA guarantees you and what public agencies don't have to do for you. For instance, public agencies don't have to create documents that don't exist. They have to give you certain documents that do exist as long as they don't fit into exemption categories, but they don't have to do work and create data and stuff like that for you. Um, it's knowing things like where should I be reaching out to contact people, and we have just published a FOIA directory to that end that you can find on our website. So it's also things like knowing to be, narrow in what you're requesting. Know ahead of time, is the information that you're looking for available somewhere else? Connecticut has open data resources. You may not need to go through FOIA to get that. You should be, as narrow and as specific as possible in your requests, particularly if you're requesting email communications. You're going to want keywords, you're going to want a time frame, and the names of people's emails that you're searching. There are certain state agencies in Connecticut that will not process your request until they have that sort of thing. And it's also just knowing, about what your rights are under FOIA when it comes to things like denials. No exemptions, be familiar with them because there are certain exemptions that you can push back on, and that we've seen public agencies abuse pretty routinely, and we've also seen them kind of fold when we say, hey, FOIA says you have to clarify this for us, and then they do when we tell them that. So, it's knowing those sort of things, and all of this is kind of written out in more detail in that post on our website. We also have some draft FOIA language there that can help you out if you don't know where to start. There are other great resources out there, like the National Freedom of Information Coalition, who has draft language for all 50 states on their websites. And of course, if you have questions or, a story about FOIA or anything of that nature, you can email us at tips@insideinvestigator.org or myself at Katherine@insideinvestigator.org.
I think it's pretty obvious that you genuinely care about this. I
Yes.
know you mentioned, yes, this is your job, but first of all, you were doing this long before you came to Inside Investigator to chase this stuff down in Connecticut. And I also think that it is really important that folks know that generally. I alluded to it at the beginning. We want to help. It's a mutually beneficial thing when we get folks who reach out and say, "Yeah, I'm not really sure about what this law is," or "Hey, here's a FOIA I got back," and we look at it and we say, "Oh boy, we can help you, get these exemptions or redactions overruled, or at least question them so we know what we're looking at." We've had a couple circumstances where we've gotten redactions back, and it's very clear that they're wrong. I don't know exactly what the word is, but overzealous perhaps in using that black pen, because I think that the expectation uh, is that the lawyers know that they know more than the general person who's out there. And I love that we can be that resource. I will also include in the show notes on places where that's possible. If you're watching this on YouTube, check in the comments. If you're listening to this on podcast, you can see that in the show notes. But if you're listening to this on the radio, or you're finding it on CT Politics TV or Roku or Apple TV, or one of the many places where this appears where that isn't possible, go to insideinvestigator.org, click on podcast in the top toolbar, and that'll take you directly to this episode where we will include notes and make sure that you have access to the resources that you need. Um, I should also mention, so often when we do investigations, they're looking back at something. So this was an interesting one where we are right on the edge of finding out whether or not this is going to be fixed. What's Lori's goal is just clarification of establishing that hybrid meetings are here to stay. I mean, they're certainly here to stay culturally for the time being, but what does success look like in terms of eliminating the opportunities for corruption here?
Yeah, first of all, interestingly, I do just want to point out that actually hybrid meetings are not here to stay in all states. And I believe it's Massachusetts that's actually debating a bill on this right now to make hybrid meetings permanent. But we are lucky that that is the case in Connecticut because it does increase public access to what government's doing and it does help increase transparency and oversight. But I think her goal here is really to, at least the way that she's described it, is she believes that effectively what the legislature intended when they passed this law was her interpretation of it, was to allow if there is a hybrid meeting that is taking place and members of a public agency are attending remotely, she believes that members of the public not only have the ability to participate and not only to attend remotely, that's not the issue right now, but also to participate remotely. So effectively, I think what she is hoping is that the FOIC is going to come back and say, like, yes, that is what the legislature intended, which would be not necessarily a rewriting of the law, but like a clarification of the law that would effectively change that the way it's going to be enforced, at least as far as the FOIC is concerned, because there has been one other case where this has come up and it's slightly different circumstances, where they ruled that the opposite of that, where they found that that board did not have to allow the public to participate remotely. So.
So I guess what I also want to pull out of that too is that the legislature, Connecticut's legislature, could address this and lay out that, hey, yes, the point of this law when it was created, I'm not sure what year this was instituted in Connecticut. I'm not sure if you know off the top of your head, but it's been a while, certainly before Zoom was a normal, typical part of our day-to-day lives. So if the intention is transparency and access and building ostensibly better government through that process, you would think that that would kind of just be a natural step, right? I mean,
Yeah.
times
Well, and
change.
that's where this is kind of an interesting history to that. Because, right, FOIA turns 50 in Connecticut this year. So the law is much older than Zoom. But this particular portion, the hybrid meetings portion of the law, goes back to an executive order that Lamont signed during COVID, which was then extended, which the legislature effectively just took, a bunch of executive orders and said, these are law now. Initially, that bill had a sunset date, and then they got rid of the sunset date. So there really isn't specific language that the legislature wrote. It's really just they took an executive order and then codified that, and that's now part of the law.
Okay. Thank you for that
Yeah.
clarification. That makes
So
a
it's
lot.
kind of a unique circumstance and really interesting because of that.
For sure. I mean, and that's also not to say that the legislature is doing nothing. You have certainly written a lot about bills that are being considered, some of them rather contentiously in the state house. There's been a lot of debate. There's been a lot of public pushback as well, public support on the other side of that for many bills. One of them that seems to be particularly interesting, maybe timely, as well as this higher education exemption bill. And I feel like, I've worked in higher ed. It's particularly interesting to me, but if you're able to share a little bit about what that is, I think it's pretty interesting to a lot of folks in this moment in time.
Yeah, so this unfortunately is not the first time that this bill has come up. This is a bill that would exempt pretty much every record that public universities like UConn create from FOIA exemption, or would make them exempt from FOIA. The language has changed a little bit over the years. At one point, it said something about proprietary records, which exactly what does that mean? Nobody knows. Right now, it's records that are kept by faculty or staff at a higher institution that arise out of a bunch of different things like teaching, medicine, science, right? And the argument for this is supposedly that education has become increasingly contentious, has become increasingly political, and so basically people are abusing FOIA to kind of harass people who are doing research at public universities. So for the past couple of years, there's been this effort to exempt those records. The problem is not only, of course, that these are public universities, so that's publicly funded research. So there is a public interest in knowing what's going on there. But it's also that this bill is much, much wider than that, and it would cover a lot of things. It would cover records from things like legal clinics. It would cover a whole swath of records that would make it very difficult to understand what's going on at universities. Connor, we just did a whole big piece about, sexual harassment by faculty at universities and at UConn specifically, or I'm sorry, at CSCU specifically, but UConn and the Coast Guard Academy were also part of that, but just didn't bother to respond to our FOIA request prior to our publication of that story. And this bill would make it much more difficult to get those kinds of records. Um, One of the things that is particularly concerning to me about this bill is you have also another bill that would affect UConn that would exempt certain records related to hate crime reporting, which we've talked about a little bit
Yeah.
from FOIA disclosure. And while there is a hate crime commission that is ostensibly, it's a state agency, or it's within a state agency, but it's a public body. It is staffed by an institute at UConn. And it's actually not the only public agency that is staffed by UConn. So if this stuff gets exempted from FOIA, now we're going to have what are government bodies that suddenly we can't get FOIA records on because they kind of, because UConn is effectively handling the day-to-day operations of that. And that's something that I think is, on top of the idea that effectively a lot of stuff that's going on at public universities is suddenly going to become unknowable, that's a follow-on effect that, I think we need to be really concerned about what that's going to mean for transparency.
Man, that was a download of information. There was a lot to unpack in there. I'm not even sure that I have any specific follow-up questions. I I am curious, I have kids, and one of the things that I did was request when I was looking at schools was request syllabi. And I don't recall that I did that through FOIA necessarily, but even something as basic as what the classroom looks like and what kind of things students are learning, from a consumer perspective. I feel like there's a lot of things included in there that, that we talk a lot about the effects of a lack of transparency. And one of them is the opportunity for corruption. That's what happens when there isn't transparency. Part of our job is to shine that spotlight into the corners as much as we can. One thing that occurs to me, though, is that if this became law, we would be that much more reliant on the courage and bravery of whistleblowers to point out when things are going wrong, which is just another hurdle. It's another barrier. And listen, I believe in the importance of privacy, of course, but privacy is for people. And when you're talking about a massive institution, man, there's a lot of stuff going on in there, especially when it's coming out of my back pocket and yours to bring it into reality. What else do people need to know about Sunshine Week before we wrap this up? And if you could also just shout out your email again. I know anyone with questions and who wants to rely on your expertise, I highly encourage it. I do it myself. So please let us know here.
Yeah, like I said, Sunshine Week, it's a great opportunity to talk about this stuff and why FOIA, like, right, I mean, Transparency Update is mostly me complaining about how terrible FOIA is in this state, and how, public agencies bend over backwards to not comply with it. And that's true, but despite all of that, FOIA is still really important, and it's the best tool that we have, as flawed as it is, to actually, hold public agencies accountable to the public. So, if you have any interest in filing a FOIA request, do it. The worst that's going to happen is they're going to tell you no. But it's a learning process. It's a really, if you want to be civically engaged, it's a really great place to start. It's a really great way, to find a community and find people who care about, the same neighborhood issues that you do. Um, and if you have questions about it, I love to talk about FOIA. Clearly, I think, Connor, we've gotten that point across. So, Catherine at InsideInvestigator.org, whether you need help drafting a FOIA request, whether you've gotten a denial that you have questions about, or you have, something that you think is a story where FOIA is being abused, or your local library board of trustees is not following open meetings law, we, and particularly me at Inside Investigator, would love to talk to you about that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. Catherine, thank you so much for your time this morning recording this. Thank you to all of you who read, watch, listen, tune in, donate. You make this work possible, and we are tremendously grateful for that. As I have said before, we are a nonprofit organization working to root out corruption in the state of Connecticut through investigative journalism, and we would love to have your support. Well, of course, we take donations just because you love our mission. We're also doing something kind of fun right now where these exclusive End Corruption hoodies and t-shirts are also available. So we will ship those out to you. We've gotten a couple orders already this week when we launched them for Sunshine Week. So please head over to insideinvestigator.org, check out all of our work, and check out Inside Update back in 2 weeks. Until then, be well, stay safe, and stay informed.